She didn't cry at the hospital. She cried 3 weeks later, alone in the car, when she found his jacket on the back seat, still carrying his smell. That smell she had tried to memorize without knowing she was trying. Engine running, fine rain tapping at the glass. And there she sat, holding a piece of fabric that was still him, while the world outside kept on turning, as though nothing had been split in two, as though a whole person could simply cease to exist, and life wouldn't have the decency to at least pause. If this story is already reaching something inside you, hit the like button and subscribe. There's a lot more of this to come, and you won't want to miss where it leads. His name was Daniel, and the first thing you need to understand about Daniel is that he was the kind of man who left an impression on a room after he'd already walked out of it. Not because he was loud. He wasn't. Not because he demanded attention. He'd have been mortified by the idea. It was something quieter than that, a quality of presence that made people feel, without being able to explain why, that the air was slightly more interesting when he was breathing it. Sarah had noticed it the first time she'd met him. At a work function, neither of them had wanted to attend. He'd been standing near the window with a glass of sparkling water, not wine, she'd noted, watching the city below with the expression of a man doing complicated arithmetic in his head. She'd asked him what he was thinking about. He'd looked at her with mild surprise, as if people didn't usually ask, and said, whether the light on those buildings is actually beautiful, or whether we've just agreed it is. She had laughed. He had not. But the corners of his eyes had done something that suggested he thought it was funny too, in a private kind of way. That was 11 years ago. Now she sat in the driveway of a house that still smelled like both of them, holding a jacket that smelled like only one, and she understood, with the particular cruelty of a realization that arrives too late to be useful, that she had never once told him what she'd thought when he'd said that. She'd never said, "That question is exactly the kind of thing that made me fall in love with you." Not once in 11 years had she found the right moment, or the right words, or some version of herself brave enough to be that honest out loud. And now the moment was gone. Not delayed, not misplaced. Gone in the permanent, irreversible way that only death can make something gone. The weeks after Daniel's death had a texture Sarah could not have anticipated and could not, afterwards, adequately describe. People spoke to her with a careful softness that made her feel like a structure that might collapse. They brought food she didn't eat and sat on sofas with their hands folded and said things like, "He was such a wonderful man, and you must be devastated," as though devastation were a temporary state, a weather event that would eventually pass and leave the landscape more or less unchanged. What nobody told her, what she suspects nobody tells anyone, because it is too strange and too specific, is that grief is not primarily an emotion. It is a cognitive disorder. It is the brain's absolute refusal to update its model of the world. For 11 years, her nervous system had been calibrated to Daniel's existence. Every room she entered, her body expected him. Every silence in the house, some animal part of her waited to hear him move. She would reach for her phone to send him something funny she'd read, and the movement would be half completed before the knowledge caught up. The knowledge never arrived gently. It always arrived like a door slamming. Her sister, Meg, called every second day. Meg was practical and loving and had no idea what to say, which made her better company than most, because at least she didn't pretend. She would call and say, "Just checking in. You don't have to talk." And Sarah would lie on the couch with the phone pressed to her ear, and they would sometimes say nothing for 10 minutes. And it was, in its strange way, the most comfort anyone offered. Her mother wanted her to come home to Ballarat. Just for a little while, sweetheart. Just to not be alone in that house. Sarah didn't go. She couldn't explain why, or she could explain it, but not in a way that would make sense to anyone who hadn't experienced it. She stayed because leaving felt like abandoning him, as though if she left, the last traces of him, the smell on the sheets she hadn't washed, the coffee mug still in the drying rack, the jacket now sitting on the passenger seat beside her, would somehow disperse, and she would lose even the ghost. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being without people, but from being without the one person who understood the specific language of your life. Daniel had known, without being told, that she needed 20 minutes of quiet after work before she could talk. He had known that she ate cereal for dinner when she was anxious, and that this was not a cry for help, but a private comfort ritual, and that the correct response was simply to pour himself a bowl as well and sit beside her in companionable silence. He had known which of her smiles was genuine and which was the face she wore at other people's parties. She had known, in return, when his quietness was contentment and when it was something heavier. She had known that he found it nearly impossible to ask for help, not from pride exactly, but from a deep, structural conviction that his difficulties were his alone to manage, that burdening others was a failure of character. She had known this about him, and she had spent 11 years gently, patiently trying to dismantle it, and she had made progress. Real progress, and now that progress belonged to no one. This is the thing about losing a person you have built a life with. You don't just lose them. You lose the version of yourself that existed in relation to them. You lose the witness, the one who was there for the Wednesday evening arguments about nothing and the Saturday mornings that were genuinely perfect, and the 100,000 unremarkable moments that only mattered because you were both in them. Sarah sat in the driveway until the rain stopped. Then she picked up the jacket and walked inside. She didn't hang it up. She put it on the chair in the bedroom. His chair, the one by the window, where he used to sit and read. And she stood there looking at it for a long time, this empty shape of a man. And she thought, I don't know how to do any of this without you. The appointment with the solicitor was on a Thursday, 10 days after the funeral. Sarah's brother-in-law, Tom, drove her, which she was grateful for in a way she didn't express, because she was still operating in that strange, muffled register where ordinary courtesy felt like a foreign language she was translating slowly in her head. The solicitor was a woman named Patricia Holt, mid-50s, precise, the kind of professional kindness that is genuine, but also practiced, because it has to be, because she does this every week. Patricia explained the process in clear, measured language. The estate, the accounts, the property. Sarah listened and nodded and signed where she was told to sign, and the entire time she had the uncanny sensation of watching herself from a slight distance, as though she were a character in a film about her own life, and the director had decided she should look composed. It was only when Patricia mentioned the superannuation, a sum considerably larger than Sarah had known about, because Daniel had been quietly, privately building it for 15 years as a kind of gift he'd never announced, that the composure cracked. Not loudly, just a sudden involuntary stillness, a held breath, the eyes doing something that Patricia clearly recognized because she slid a box of tissues across the desk without comment. That was so entirely him. To have done something that generous and that patient and that unannounced for 15 years, and to have died before she could thank him for it. On the drive home, Tom didn't speak. He understood, the way good men sometimes do, that silence was the only thing that fit. There is a moment, somewhere in the first months of grief, when the world begins, tentatively, apologetically, as if it knows it has no business doing so, to come back into focus, not to return to normal. It never returns to normal. But the sharp, suffocating quality of the early loss begins to settle into something more chronic, more livable, like a change in climate, rather than a storm. You start to remember things you'd liked before him, and you start to suspect, cautiously, that you might like them again. For Sarah, this moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in late April. She had gone for a walk, the first proper one since the funeral. Not the dazed shuffles to the letterbox and back, but an actual walk through the park 2 streets over, with her hands in her pockets and the evening air carrying the last of the autumn. And she had noticed, almost against her will, that the light on the trees was doing something extraordinary. That gold and amber trick that deciduous trees perform in the late afternoon, the way they seem briefly to be lit from inside. She stood there watching it for a long time, and she thought of Daniel, standing by a window 11 years ago, asking whether the light on the buildings was actually beautiful or whether they'd simply agreed it was. She thought, I think it's actually beautiful. I think that's a real thing. And I think you knew that too. And the question wasn't really skepticism, it was wonder. You were wondering out loud. She thought, I should have told you that. The light changed. The moment passed. She walked home. But something had shifted, quietly, fractionally, the way the first degree of spring shifts imperceptibly from winter. She was still in the dark. But somewhere ahead of her, she had caught the faintest suggestion of a direction, and for now, that was enough. Not by looking for it. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular. She had simply reached the point 6 weeks after the funeral where the house needed to be dealt with. Not packed up, not cleared. She wasn't ready for that, and wouldn't be for a long time, and she'd made peace with that fact. But there were drawers that had been stuck since winter, and a shelf in the study that was bowed under the weight of books that hadn't been touched in years, and the general domestic neglect that accumulates quietly in a house where grief has taken up residence and displaced all ordinary maintenance. She had started in the study because it felt marginally less intimate than the bedroom. A desk Daniel had used, but that had always been, in some half-articulated way, shared neutral territory. She'd gone through the top drawer without incident. Pens, a broken stapler, 3 USB drives, whose contents she couldn't identify, an envelope of old receipts. She'd felt efficient, almost normal. She had allowed herself a small private satisfaction in that. The notebook was in the bottom drawer, underneath a road atlas of Victoria they hadn't used since the trip to the Grampians 4 years ago, and a manila folder of instruction manuals for appliances they no longer owned. It was an ordinary thing, black cover, wire-bound, the kind sold in service stations and news agencies for $3. His name was not on it. Nothing identified it as his, except that it was in his drawer, in his house, in the specific handwriting she would have recognized anywhere on earth. She sat down on the study floor, and she opened it. He had been keeping it for nearly 2 years. The first entry was dated March, almost 26 months before he died, and it began without preamble or explanation. The way a person begins writing to themselves when they are not sure yet what they are writing or why. The The first line read, "I have been thinking about whether I am living the right life. Not unhappily, just carefully." Sarah read it 3 times. Then she closed the notebook and set it face down on the floor beside her, as if it were a thing that needed to be approached from a greater distance. And she sat there with her back against the desk and her knees pulled to her chest, and she looked at the bookshelves and she breathed. She had not known about the notebook. More than that, she had not known this version of her husband existed, or she had suspected it. In the vague peripheral way you suspect a room has furniture before you've turned the light on. But she had never heard it said plainly. Not by him. Not in 11 years. "I have been thinking about whether I am living the right life." She picked it up again. She read for 2 hours. The notebook was not a journal in the conventional sense. There were no daily entries, no cataloging of events. Daniel had written in it sporadically, sometimes 3 entries in a week, then nothing for 2 months. The entries were more like essays than diary passages. Long, circling reflections on work, on time, on what he described more than once as the distance between the life he'd imagined and the life he was actually inside. He was not unhappy. He said this in several different ways. But he was restless in a manner he seemed to have no outlet for, and he was grappling, privately and seriously, with questions he'd apparently never quite known how to raise out loud. He wrote about his father, a topic that had always been closed between them, closed in the way of something sealed rather than empty, and Sarah had learned early not to press on it. In the notebook, he opened it himself. He wrote about a man who had been physically present and emotionally inaccessible throughout Daniel's childhood. Not cruel, not absent in the literal sense, but closed off in a way that had taught Daniel, by steady accumulation, that feelings were private inconveniences and that showing them was a kind of weakness. He wrote, "I think I am still unlearning him. I think I will be unlearning him for the rest of my life. I wonder sometimes if Sarah knows how much she has helped with that without knowing she was helping." She stopped there, read it again. Her throat did something complicated. He had known. He had known exactly what she'd been doing all those years of patience, all those years of sitting beside him in the serial evenings and the quiet mornings and the slow, careful work of making it safe for a private man to speak. He had known, and he had been grateful, and it had been in this drawer, written in blue biro, in his particular angular hand, for 2 years. She had been so certain, in these last 6 weeks, that the defining regret of her life would be the things she hadn't said to him. She hadn't considered, until this moment, that he might have had the same regret in reverse. The entry dated the previous September, 7 months before he died, though she had no way of knowing that, as she read it, because the death had not happened yet in the chronology of the notebook, was the longest in the book. It ran for 11 pages, written in a hand slightly less controlled than usual, as though he'd been writing quickly or writing late. He had been to a conference in Canberra, which she remembered. She remembered because he'd rung her from the hotel on the second night, sounding flat and remote in the way that sometimes happened when he'd been around a lot of people and had used up all his social capacity. She had asked if he was all right, and he had said yes. Of course, just tired, and she had believed him because it fit the pattern, and because she'd been tired herself, and because there was no reason not to believe him. In the notebook, he described the conference as nearly unbearable, not because it was bad, professionally, but because of something that had happened on the second afternoon. A conversation with a man named Jeff, a colleague from his early career whom he hadn't seen in a decade, who had asked him over a beer in the hotel bar whether he ever thought about the project they'd worked on together in 2009, a research project that had gone nowhere, had been defunded after 18 months, had dissolved like so many things dissolve in the particular demoralizing way of institutional research. Daniel had said, sometimes, and Jeff had said, I think about it constantly. I think it was the most important work I've ever been part of. And we just stopped. Daniel had written, I drove back to the hotel after dinner and sat in the car for a long time. I don't know what I was waiting for. I kept thinking about that project, about what it might have become, about the version of my career in which I'd fought harder to keep it alive instead of accepting the defunding, like something inevitable. I don't know why I didn't fight harder. I think I was afraid that if I fought and lost, I'd have to accept that the thing I cared about most was gone. So I let it go quietly, which achieved the same result but spared me the humiliation of trying. He had written, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to keep choosing the version of life that protects me from failure over the version that might actually be something. And then, in smaller writing at the bottom of the page, as if added later, or as if said under his breath, I should talk to Sarah about this. She would know what to say. She always does. She sat with the notebook for the rest of the afternoon. The light in the study moved through its usual arc, shifted from white to amber to the flat gray of late afternoon, and she barely noticed. She read every entry. She read carefully, the way you read something you know you will need to return to, that you know will take multiple readings before you have extracted everything it contains. By the time she finished, the house was dark, and she had not eaten since morning, and she was feeling something she couldn't immediately name. Not sadness, exactly, or not only sadness. Something more compound than that. Something that included grief, but also something that felt unexpectedly close to gratitude, which made no immediate sense, and which she turned over slowly, trying to understand it. She was grateful because the notebook told her something she had needed to know without knowing she needed it, that Daniel had been, underneath the composed and private surface, as uncertain and searching as anyone, that his quietness had not been contentment mistaken for depth, but genuine depth that was also genuinely uncertain, that he had loved her, not in spite of her directness and her patience and her habit of gently pressing on the things he kept closed, but because of them, that she had not, as she'd sometimes feared in the bleak, middle-of-the-night version of grief, loved someone who had remained fundamentally unreachable. She had been reaching him, slowly, imperfectly, over 11 years. She had been reaching him, and he had been reaching back, in his own way, in the only language he'd been able to use, which was the private language of ink on paper in the bottom drawer. She rang Meg that night from the kitchen, standing at the bench with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. I found something, she said. Meg waited. She was good at waiting. He kept a notebook. For the last 2 years. I never knew about it. A pause. Good things or good things. Hard things. True things. Sarah looked at the notebook on the bench in front of her. He was trying to figure out how to be more honest. He wrote it all down because he couldn't say it yet, I think. Because writing it was the practice run. Oh, Dan, Meg said softly. She had always been fond of Daniel, in the uncomplicated way of a sister-in-law who had watched him become better over time and loved him for the effort. The thing is, Sarah said slowly, the last entry is from 3 weeks before he died, and in it, he wrote, she picked up the notebook and found the page, even though she already knew it by heart. He wrote, I think I'm ready. I think I've been preparing for a conversation with Sarah for about 2 years, and I think I'm finally ready to have it out loud. I'm going to tell her about the project, and about Dad, and about all of it. I'm going to stop keeping the interesting parts of myself in a drawer. She heard Meg go very quiet. He never got to, Sarah said. The words came out steady, which surprised her. He died on the 10th. He wrote that on the 21st of the month before. He was 3 weeks away from telling me everything. The silence on the line was long and full, and the right kind of silence, not the silence of not knowing what to say, but the silence of two people sitting with something too large for immediate language. Eventually, Meg said, He loved you so much. I know, Sarah said. That's what makes it so devastating. And also, she stopped. Also what? She thought about it for another moment. About the light on the trees 2 weeks ago. About Daniel by the window 11 years ago. About the notebook in the drawer. 2 years of quiet courage, building towards a conversation that had run out of time. Also, she said, what makes it, I don't know, not okay? Nothing makes it okay, but something I can hold on to. She pressed her hand flat against the notebook's cover, feeling the slight texture of it, the realness of it. He was trying to get there. He was actually trying. She stayed on the phone with Meg for another hour. They didn't talk about Daniel the whole time. At one point, they talked about Meg's youngest, who had decided to learn the drums, which was exactly as disruptive as it sounded, and that felt right too. That felt like the correct proportion of things. The grief and the life existing alongside each other in their true simultaneous way, neither one canceling the other out. Before she went to bed, Sarah put the notebook on the bedside table. Daniel's side. She lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, but not resisting not sleeping, which was a small new skill she had been developing. Just lying there, present to the room, present to the sounds of the neighborhood, settling into night. She thought about the research project he'd mentioned, the one from 2009. She realized she knew almost nothing about it. He'd been working on it when they first got together, but she'd been new to him then, and he'd been new to her, and she had not yet learned which questions would open him and which would close him off, and so she had not pressed. Later, when the project was gone, and clearly a source of some quiet pain, she had not pressed either, for different reasons. She found that she wanted to know about it now. She wanted to understand this part of him she'd never been shown. Not to undo the loss. There was no undoing it, but because he was still a person whose depths she was still discovering. And that discovery did not stop with his death, and she had not yet fully understood that until tonight. You could keep learning a person after they were gone. The knowledge arrived differently, and it was missing the irreplaceable texture of being told directly, of seeing the face and the hands while the words were spoken. But it arrived. The notebook was proof of that, and there were probably other things, other people, other places, other drawers, metaphorical and otherwise, that she hadn't opened yet. The thought was not comforting in any simple way. It was more complex than comfort. It was the feeling of a door, long assumed to be locked, turning out to be merely closed. She reached out and touched the spine of the notebook in the dark, the small pressure of it against her fingers. She thought, I'm still listening. Whatever you were going to tell me, I'm still here. I'm still listening. She slept. It took her 4 days to decide to contact Jeff. Not 4 days of deliberation exactly, more like 4 days of circling, the way you circle something you know you are going to do eventually and are simply, on some level, not ready to do yet. She had read the Canberra entry in the notebook 3 more times. She had looked up Jeff's name in Daniel's email contacts, which she had access to through the shared family laptop, and found him listed simply as Jeff Marsden, Uni of Melbourne, with an address that was 6 years old and may or may not have still been current. She had opened a new email to him twice, written nothing, and closed it. On the fourth morning, she wrote, "My name is Sarah Calloway. Daniel was my husband. He passed away in May. I found a notebook in which he wrote about a conversation you had in Canberra last year, about a research project you both worked on in 2009. I know this is a strange message to receive from a stranger. I'm trying to understand things about Daniel that I didn't know. If you'd be willing to talk, I would be very grateful." She sent it before she could rethink it. His reply arrived in 40 minutes. It was brief and warm and said, "I was so sorry to hear about Daniel. I didn't know. Of course I'll talk. Can you call this afternoon?" His voice was the voice of a man who spent a great deal of time thinking before he spoke, measured, slightly deliberate, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades in seminar rooms and had internalized the habit of precision. He told her straight away that he'd been fond of Daniel, that Daniel had been one of the sharpest minds he'd encountered in 30 years in research, and that he'd meant what he said in Canberra, every word of it. "Can you tell me what the project was?" Sarah asked. She was sitting at the kitchen bench with a notepad in front of her, though she hadn't written anything yet. "He never really explained it to me. I knew it existed. I knew it ended badly, but I never understood what it actually was." A brief pause. "You know what Daniel was working on before he moved into his current role?" "Broadly, biochemistry, origins research. I was never entirely sure of the specifics." "Right." Jeff paused again, not hesitating, she thought, but gathering. What Daniel and I were working on in 2009 was a question about the transition point, the threshold between complex chemistry and the first living system. Specifically, and this is where it gets complicated, to explain simply, we were trying to map the minimum conditions under which a self-replicating RNA molecule could maintain itself in a hydrothermal environment. We thought we'd found a thermal gradient in certain alkaline vent systems that might have made the whole thing not just possible, but almost inevitable. Almost, he paused, predictable. Sarah wrote the word predictable on the notepad and underlined it. The implication being, she said slowly, that life wasn't a fluke. That's exactly it. That the chemistry was set up by the physics of those early ocean systems to do almost exactly what it did. That the origin of life wasn't an accident that happened to this particular planet. It was something the universe was, for want of a better word, inclined towards. Another pause. Daniel was better at saying this than I am. He had this phrase he used when we were writing it up. He called it organized inevitability. The idea that the universe isn't just compatible with life, it actively builds toward it. Sarah sat very still. Through the kitchen window, the jacaranda in the back garden was doing what it did every November, shedding its purple flowers in slow drifts onto the grass, and she watched it without seeing it, her whole attention inward. She said, "He never told me any of this." "I'm not entirely surprised," Jeff said quietly. It was painful territory for him. After the project ended, he'd put an enormous amount of himself into it. And when the funding was pulled, why was it pulled? He exhaled. The short answer is that it didn't produce results on the timeline the grant committee wanted. The longer answer is that it was producing results. It just wasn't producing the kind that fit neatly into a 3-year deliverables framework. We were doing foundational work, patient work, the kind that doesn't publish in flashy journals every 6 months, and the institution had other priorities. A pause that had something tired in it. It was a bureaucratic decision that had nothing to do with the quality of the science. Daniel knew that, but I don't think it made it easier. She drove to the university the following Thursday. It had been on the list of things to do for 2 months, collecting Daniel's personal effects from his office, a task his department head had raised gently and repeatedly, and which Sarah had been postponing because it required a version of herself she hadn't yet located, the version that could walk into a room full of his things and bring them home in a cardboard box without that act constituting a kind of final erasure. She had decided, after the call with Jeff, that she was ready, or close enough to ready, that the distinction no longer seemed worth protecting. The department was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and whiteboard cleaner, a smell that was so specifically academic that it produced a small, unexpected pang. Daniel had smelled faintly of this on the evenings he came home late, and she had never once registered it consciously until this moment in the corridor. The body's archive of the people we love is cataloged in ways the mind doesn't know about until it trips over an entry. His colleague Priya was waiting for her at the lift. Priya was younger than Sarah had expected. Early 30s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of composed warmth that suggested she had put deliberate thought into how to be present for this particular meeting. She shook Sarah's hand and said simply, "I'm so glad you came. We've all missed him terribly." They walked through an open-plan space, full of desks and monitors, and people who glanced up and then glanced away, with the careful consideration of people who knew who she was and why she was there. At the far end, a glass-walled office. Priya opened the door and stood back. Sarah went in, alone. She had imagined it would be worse. She had built it up over 2 months into something almost unendurable. Daniel's space, Daniel's objects, Daniel's absence made architectural. But when she stood in the doorway, what she felt was not the anticipated devastation. It was something quieter, and in some ways, stranger. The office looked like him. That was the simplest way to put it. Not because it was especially personal. It was a university office, after all. Institutional furniture, institutional shelves. But the arrangement was his. The books ordered not alphabetically, but by some private associative logic that she recognized from every bookshelf he'd ever owned. The small fern on the windowsill that she had not known about, which he had evidently kept alive for some time, judging by its size. A framed photograph on the desk she had given him 3 Christmases ago. The 2 of them on the Mornington Peninsula, laughing at something off camera, the wind doing whatever it wanted with her hair. She sat in his chair. She rarely let herself do things like this, inhabit his positions, his perspectives, because it carried a kind of pain that had no buffer. But she sat in it now and looked at the room from where he had looked at it every day for 7 years, and she tried to feel what it had felt like to be him in this space. She thought about organized inevitability, the idea that the universe builds toward life, that beneath the apparent randomness of chemistry and physics and time, There is something like a tendency, a lean, a slow inclination toward complexity and meaning. She thought about whether Daniel had believed that, whether doing this research had given him, for the 18 months it lasted, a sense that his own life was part of something with a similar architecture, something that was moving, however obliquely, toward something. She thought, I think he did believe it. I think losing the project was losing that. She thought, I think he spent the next decade trying to find it again, in different forms, in different places, and I think he was beginning to find it. She was almost certain, reading the notebook, reading the final entry, that he was beginning to find it again. Priya knocked gently at 20 minutes and offered tea, which Sarah accepted. They sat in the office together while the afternoon light moved across the carpet, and Priya talked about Daniel in the way that people do when they are trying to give you a version of a person you might not already have, not to replace yours, but to add to it. She described him as demanding in the specific way of someone who holds others to the same standard he holds himself, which could be difficult and was also, over time, a form of respect. She said he had a habit of disagreeing with you very precisely, not broadly, not dismissively, but with surgical accuracy on the exact point where he thought you'd gone wrong, and that this had frustrated her enormously when she first joined the department and had later come to seem like the most useful quality a colleague could possess. He spoke about you, Priya said. Not often. He wasn't the type, but when he did, it was always in this particular tone, like you were the settled part of everything. Like the rest of it, the work, the uncertainty, whatever he was wrestling with, had a stable point because of you. Sarah held her mug with both hands and said nothing for a moment. Did he ever talk to you about older work? She asked. Research he did before this role? Something from 2009. Priya tilted her head slightly, considering. Once, maybe twice. It came up when we were writing a review paper. There was a section on hydrothermal chemistry, and he mentioned he'd worked in that area. He said something like, she paused, retrieving it, something like, there was a period where I thought I'd found the most important question I would ever work on, and then I stopped working on it. He said it in a way that was clearly meant to end the conversation, so I let it. That sounds like him, Sarah said. It does, Priya agreed quietly, but I always wondered about it. What the question was. How life began, Sarah said. She heard how strange it sounded, stated plainly in an office on a Thursday afternoon. Not metaphorically, actually. How chemistry became biology. He thought he was close to something. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, well, that does seem like it would be worth protecting if you thought you'd found it, even if protecting it meant not talking about it. She paused, or maybe especially then. She loaded the box into the back of the car herself. Books, the small fern, wrapped in newspaper, because she hadn't thought to bring a bag for it. The photograph, a coffee mug, not the one she'd seen in the drying rack at home, which was his everyday one, but a second mug she hadn't known existed, with the logo of a conference she didn't recognize from a year before they'd met. Proof that he had been a whole person with a history that predated her, which she knew in the abstract, and which this small ceramic object made suddenly, sharply specific. Before she left, she had asked Priya one more thing. The research from 2009, would any of the data still exist? Any of the records? Priya had looked at her with an expression that was partly curious and partly something more careful. Possibly, institutional data from that period, if it was archived properly, might be in the university's research repository, or Jeff Marsden might have copies. Why? Sarah had thought about the last entry in the notebook, about Daniel writing, "I think I'm ready," about organized inevitability, about the possibility that a question doesn't stop being worth asking just because the person who first asked it is gone. "I want to understand what he was working on," she said. "The whole thing. From the beginning." She could not have explained precisely why this felt important. She was not a scientist. She had a degree in English literature and managed communications for an environmental NGO, and had no particular grounding in biochemistry or prebiotic chemistry or the geophysics of hydrothermal vents. The research was not hers to continue. She was not under any illusion that it was. But Daniel had been 3 weeks away from telling her everything, and he had not gotten there. And the notebook had given her back some of what the silence had taken, but not all of it. Not the part she now wanted most. The work itself. The question itself. The thing he had called, in the private language of his most unguarded self, the most important question he had ever worked on. She drove home in the early evening, the box on the back seat, the fern still wrapped in newspaper, the city coming apart into its amber hour. She thought about chemistry building toward complexity, about the universe leaning in a direction, about all the things that had seemed, in the flat gray of early grief, like they were simply over, finished, sealed, irretrievable, and how many of them had turned out, on closer inspection, to be merely interrupted. The difference between finished and interrupted was, she was beginning to think, everything. Jeff sent the files on a Tuesday, 11 days after their phone call. 3 attachments in a single email, no subject line, and a message that read only, "These are the ones Daniel was most proud of. Take your time with them." She opened the email at the kitchen bench at 7 in the morning, before the day had started in any meaningful sense, still in the cotton shirt she'd slept in, her hair unwashed, a cup of tea going cold to her left. She looked at the file names for a moment. 2 draft papers with long technical titles, and 1 document labeled simply Notes D. Calloway, 2009, and felt in a way she couldn't rationalize that she needed to be more prepared than this before she opened them. She showered. She made fresh tea. She sat at the desk in the study, not the kitchen bench, because the kitchen bench felt like a place for ordinary tasks, and this did not feel like an ordinary task. Then she opened the first file. The draft paper was dense and technical in ways she could follow only partially, but she read it with the specific attention she used when reading difficult literature, not trying to absorb every detail at once, but listening for the shape of the argument, the underlying architecture, the places where the language shifted from the procedural to the urgent. And there were such places. Several times in the paper's introduction, and again in the discussion, she caught a tone that was unmistakably Daniel's, the careful, compressed excitement of a man who had trained himself to understate and who could not, here, entirely manage it. The central claim was this, that in the alkaline hydrothermal vent systems of the early ocean, the natural chemistry was not merely compatible with the emergence of self-replicating molecules, but was structurally configured to drive it. That the proton gradients, the mineral surfaces, the thermal cycling, all of it worked together as a kind of unconscious machinery, a planetary scale process oriented, by pure physics, toward increasing chemical complexity. Life, the paper argued, was not a statistical miracle that had scraped through against impossible odds. It was the expected output of a system that had been running its calculations since the Earth was 400 million years old. She read that sentence 3 times. The expected output. She thought about Daniel, lying awake at night with whatever it was he was carrying. She thought about all the years of quiet preparation before the notebook's final entry. She thought about a man who spent his professional life arguing that the universe tends toward life, and who spent his private life slowly, painstakingly, learning to let his own interior life emerge. She thought he wasn't just studying this, he was living it. He was his own experiment. The document labeled Notes D. Calloway, 2009 was not a paper. It was a working document, a space between thinking and writing, the kind of file a researcher keeps for ideas that are not yet ready to be formalized. It was dated across almost the entire 18-month span of the project, from March 2008 to September 2009, and it was, in places, barely legible in the sense that it assumed a context she didn't have and referenced conversations and readings without explanation, the way a person's private notes always do. But there were passages she understood completely, and they stopped her cold. In one entry from November 2008, he had written, "The thing I keep coming back to is the threshold question, not how the molecules assembled. We're making progress on that. But the moment the system became self-referential, the moment chemistry started making decisions about its own continuation, because there's no gradual here. There's no such thing as slightly alive. Either the system is maintaining itself against entropy, or it isn't. And something happened, some specific configuration of molecules, in some specific physical context, at some specific moment, and the universe crossed a line it had never crossed before. I want to know what was on either side of that line. I want to understand what changed." She sat with that for a long time. What changed? She knew, from her own last 7 months, something about what it felt like to stand on either side of a line that could not be uncrossed. Before and after. The before in which Daniel existed, and the after in which he did not. And the strange, disorienting work of finding out who you were in the after when so much of what you'd known about yourself had been calibrated to the before. She understood, she thought, why this question had mattered to him so deeply. It wasn't only scientific curiosity, though it was certainly that. It was something more personal. He was a man who had spent his life near the threshold of his own emotional availability, trying to understand what it would take to cross it. The chemistry of the question and the chemistry of his character had been, for 18 months, asking the same thing. What does it take to become? She rang Robert on a Thursday. Daniel's father lived alone in a weatherboard house in Bendigo, the same house Daniel had grown up in, and had lived there alone since Daniel's mother, Carol, had died of a stroke 8 years earlier. He was 69, still drove, still kept a garden that Daniel had described in the notebook as the one domain in which his father expressed something resembling care without apparent effort or self-consciousness. Robert had come to the funeral. He had sat in the 3rd row and had not cried, not visibly, and had shaken Sarah's hand at the wake and said, "You made him very happy." 4 words. Then he had driven back to Bendigo the same afternoon. She had not spoken to him since. There was no animosity in this. It was simply the shape of things. Robert and Daniel had achieved over the years a functional and cautious détente. Regular phone calls that covered the practical and the meteorological monthly visits that followed reliable patterns and avoided reliable subjects. They had both known this was not enough, and had both, in their different ways, been too afraid of the alternative to change it. She knew this from the notebook. She suspected Robert knew it too. In whatever register, a man like Robert knew things. He picked up on the second ring. Sarah, not surprised, exactly, but careful. The voice of a man taking a step he wasn't sure of. Robert, I'm sorry it's been so long. I should have called sooner. You've had enough to manage. A pause. How are you going? The question was genuine, she thought. Spare and genuine. The way his son's questions had sometimes been when he was still learning how to ask them. Some days better than others, she said. I'm starting to find my way back into things. I actually called because, she paused, deciding on the simplest version. I've been learning things about Daniel I didn't know, about his research, about some of what he was working through privately, and I thought, I didn't want you not to know that I'm thinking about you in all of this, that he thought about you. A silence that was not empty. He was a hard one to know, Robert said finally. I know that came from me. I've known that for a long time. His voice was even, with the studied evenness of a man delivering something he has rehearsed without intending to rehearse it. I didn't have a good example to follow for the talking side of things. My old man was, well, you know the type. I do, Sarah said quietly. Daniel got further than I did. He could say more, not always out loud, but he got further. A pause. I could tell, by the end, that he was trying. More than before. I didn't say anything about it because I didn't know how to say it without making it into something awkward. But I could tell. Sarah felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes, the one she had stopped fighting. He wrote about you, she said, in a notebook. He wrote that he thought he was still unlearning some of the things he'd learned as a kid. But he wrote it without blame. He was very clear about that. It was analytical, almost. He was trying to understand it, not assign it. Another silence. Longer this time. That sounds like him, Robert said. And then, in a voice that was marginally less controlled, I'd like to read it. Whenever you're ready. If you think that would be all right. I think it would be more than all right, Sarah said. I think it's exactly what he would have wanted. She drove to Bendigo on the last Saturday of November. It was a warm day, the kind of late spring day that in Melbourne simply exists as a brief interruption between the miserable cool and the oppressive heat, and the drive up the Calder was familiar enough to be automatic. Daniel had driven this road dozens of times. She had driven it beside him, and the landscape had a companionable quality that she hadn't expected and was grateful for. The red gum country opening out past Gisborne, the sky going wide. Robert met her at the door. He was a tall man going thin at the edges, with Daniel's forehead and Daniel's habit of looking at things directly, without apparent self-consciousness. He was wearing a blue cotton shirt that had been ironed, which she suspected was an effort made specifically for today, and she felt a complicated rush of fondness for him. This stiff, genuine, limited, trying man. He had made lunch, sandwiches and a pot of tea, set out on the kitchen table, with a care that spoke of practice, rather than comfort, because there was nothing comfortable about this, and neither of them pretended there was. They sat and ate and talked about the garden, which was in good shape, tomatoes, zucchini, the last of the spring beans, and about Bendigo, and about Meg's youngest, and the drums, which made Robert produce a sound that might have been a laugh, and then, gradually, they moved toward the real conversation, the way you move toward cold water, incrementally And then all at once, she had brought the notebook. She had not been certain, on the drive up, whether she would hand it over or simply read from it. But when Robert reached across the table in a gesture that was uncharacteristically direct for him, just his hand, open, waiting, she gave it to him without hesitation. He read for a long time. She cleared the plates. She washed them at the sink and looked out at the garden and let him have the privacy of it. When she came back to the table, he was on the last pages. She sat down and waited. He closed the notebook and set it on the table between them. His hands were flat on either side of it, as if steadying something. He didn't look up immediately. He understood more than I gave him credit for, he said. His voice was changed. Not broken, not dramatically altered, but changed in the way of something that has been under pressure and has quietly redistributed itself. I thought the distance between us was something he resented, that I'd failed him, and he knew it, and we'd both just agreed to not mention it. He didn't resent it, Sarah said. He was working on it. He was working on himself. He was very close, by the end. Robert nodded. A single slow movement. He looked out the window at the garden. He used to ring me on Sunday evenings, he said. Every week, without fail. Sometimes we'd talk for 5 minutes. Sometimes 20. Always ended the same way. He'd say, "All right then, I'll let you go." And I'd say, "Righto, talk soon." And I never once said anything beyond the surface of it. Never said, "I love you," or "I'm proud of you," or "I'm glad you ring." He paused. I am, though. Was. All of it. He knew, Sarah said, with a certainty she had not known she possessed until this moment. It's in there. He knew. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, across the notebook and the teacups and the hands of two people who were both, in their different ways, downstream of the same man, and they sat in it together, not comfortably, exactly, but honestly, which was, she was beginning to understand what Daniel had been trying to build his whole life. Not comfort, but honesty. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of truth inside it. On the drive back, the sun behind her and the sky ahead going from blue to that particular, unnameable color that precedes the dark, she thought about the notes file on her laptop, about the threshold question, about what changes when a system becomes self-referential, when chemistry starts making decisions about its own continuation. She thought about Robert reading the notebook, about the look on his face when he'd closed it, about the way grief, in the right conditions, could become something other than only loss, could become, slowly and at great cost, and without any guarantee, a kind of opening, a reconfiguration, the same elements, reorganized under new pressure, into something that had not previously existed. She thought, Daniel spent 18 months trying to understand the moment chemistry crossed into life. I think he was asking the question about himself the whole time. I think it was always about more than molecules, she thought, and I think I am asking it now too. What does it take? What specific configuration? What precise pressure? What particular combination of loss and love, and honesty and time, allows a person to cross from the life they were living into a life that is genuinely, irrevocably their own? She did not have an answer. She suspected the answer was not the kind that arrived, fully formed. She suspected it was the kind that accumulated, molecule by molecule, if you wanted to be literal about it, until one day the system was simply, quietly, undeniably alive, in a way it had not been before. She drove. The road came on. The dark gathered slowly at the edges, and the headlights took over where the sun left off, and the distance between where she had been and where she was going shrank by degrees, the way all distances eventually do. Somewhere in the third week of December, without quite deciding to, Sarah started writing. Not the notebook. She couldn't bring herself to write in the notebook, which still sat on Daniel's side of the bedside table and which she read from occasionally in small amounts, the way you read something you are trying to understand rather than consume. Not a diary either, because a diary implied a daily accounting of events, and her days did not yet have enough events to account for. What she started on a Wednesday evening, when the house was very quiet and the heat was beginning to settle in for the summer, was something without a name, a document on the laptop with no title, no intended audience, no particular destination, a place where she could think in sentences rather than fragments. She had been reading Jeff's files for 3 weeks by then, slowly, non-linearly, the way you read something in a language you are still acquiring, going back over passages you've partly understood, looking up terms, building the vocabulary as you went. She had a notebook of her own now, a plain one from the news agency, nothing like Daniel's, and in it, she had been writing definitions and questions, and the occasional sentence that had seemed important enough to transcribe. She had written, RNA can carry information and catalyze reactions simultaneously. It is the message and the machinery at once. And she had underlined it twice, and then sat looking at it for several minutes without entirely knowing why it felt so significant. On the Wednesday evening in December, she opened the laptop and she wrote, there is a molecule at the heart of the origin of life story that does something no other molecule in the known universe does, or at least no other molecule that predates life itself. It carries the instructions for its own replication, and at the same time, it performs the chemical work of carrying them out. It is simultaneously the blueprint and the builder, the information and the action, the message and the hand that writes it. She stopped, read it back. It was not quite right yet, but it was heading somewhere, and that was enough. She kept writing. By the time she stopped, it was past midnight, and she had written almost 2,000 words, and the tea she had made at 9 o'clock was long cold, and the house outside the pool of the desk lamp was very dark and very quiet. She read back over what she had written with the particular mix of exposure and curiosity that comes from reading your own unexpected work, the slight disbelief that it has come from you, and the stronger pull of recognition that it has come from nowhere else. She had written about the RNA world, about the hydrothermal vents and the proton gradients, and the thermal cycling that could have driven the first replicating chemistry, about Daniel's phrase, organized inevitability, and what it meant. Not that life was inevitable in a fatalistic sense, not that a specific species on a specific planet was written into the physics from the start, but that the conditions of the early Earth were configured by chemistry and geology and deep time to produce increasing complexity. That life was not a fluke that had squeaked through against impossible odds. It was, in a specific and defensible scientific sense, what the system was inclined to do. She had written about what it felt like to learn this, about sitting in Daniel's study chair and reading his words and understanding, slowly, that the question he had devoted 18 months of his professional life to was also the question his personal life had been asking in parallel. What does it take to become something more than the sum of your conditions? What specific configuration allows a system, chemical or human, to cross from maintaining itself defensively to generating something genuinely new? She had not written about Daniel by name. She had written around him, in the way you write around a light source that is too direct to look at directly, but he was present in every sentence, the way a certain kind of music is present in a room even after it has stopped playing, not heard, but felt in the resonance of things. She saved the document as simply becoming. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed and lay in the dark for a while, not thinking about what she had written, just letting it exist somewhere outside her, at a comfortable distance, the way you let a letter sit on the table after you have written it and before you have decided whether to send it. She met Jeff in person for the first time on a Friday morning in the middle of December at a cafe on Ligon Street that he'd suggested, and that turned out to be the kind of place that had been serving the same good coffee to the same university people since approximately 1987 and had no interest in being anything other than that. He was smaller than she had imagined from his voice, compact, white-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the slightly distracted affect of a man whose mind is reliably elsewhere and who has made peace with this about himself. He stood when she came in and shook her hand firmly and said it was good to finally meet her, and she believed him. They talked for nearly 3 hours. She had not anticipated 3 hours. She had imagined something more bounded, coffee, an hour, polite and grateful on her part, generous and a little sad on his. But it didn't go that way. It went the way of two people who have a subject in common that they have each been thinking about intensely and separately, and who discover, in the early exchanges, that the other person is more genuinely interested than they had allowed themselves to hope. He told her things about Daniel she hadn't known, not revelations, not secrets, but the texture of a professional self she had never directly observed. How Daniel had run their lab meetings with a rigor that some people found confronting and others found clarifying, and how he had always, without exception, been hardest on his own ideas first. How he had a habit of writing the conclusion of a paper before the introduction, on the grounds that you couldn't properly explain where you were going until you knew where you'd arrived. How he had once spent an entire Friday afternoon reworking a single paragraph in their joint paper, not because the science was wrong, but because the language wasn't carrying the weight of what the science actually meant, and how he had eventually looked up at Jeff and said, "It has to sound like what it is. It has to feel like the size of the thing." Sarah wrote that in her own notebook. It has to feel like the size of the thing. He was a writer, she said, underneath the science. He was trying to write the truth of it. Jeff considered this. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." And it made him slow, in the way that some funding bodies don't have patience for. But it also meant that when he finally said something, it was worth saying. He turned his coffee cup by its handle, a small rotating motion. The work he was doing was worth saying. I still believe that. I believe it more now, actually, than I did when we were in the middle of it. Why more now? Because the field has caught up to where we were in 2009, he said. Not with our specific model, but with the central argument, the alkaline vent hypothesis, the role of proton gradients in the emergence of metabolism, the idea that life's energy systems are geological in origin. It's all mainstream now. Nick Lane, at University College London, Mike Russell's group, others. The question Daniel and I were asking is now one of the central questions in the field. He paused, which means we were right to ask it. We were just asking it 10 years too soon, at an institution that didn't have the patience to wait. Sarah felt something tighten and then release in her chest. So, the work wasn't lost. The work was never lost, Jeff said. It just sat there, waiting, the way good questions do. She told him about the document she had started writing. She hadn't planned to. It had come out sideways, in the middle of a conversation about science communication, when he'd said something about how poorly the origin of life research was understood by general audiences, and she had said, without thinking, "I've been trying to write about it, actually, for people who don't have the background." He had looked at her with an interest that was sudden and specific. "What kind of writing?" "I'm not sure yet. It's only been a few weeks. But I have a background in communications. I've spent years translating complex environmental science for non-specialist audiences. And I've been living inside this material for 2 months now. I think I might understand what the difficulty is for a general reader, where the wonder is if you can find the right way in." "The wonder," Jeff repeated. He said it as though it were a technical term he was evaluating. That's the thing that most science writing loses. It describes the mechanism and forgets that the mechanism is astonishing. That we are sitting here, two living things made of cells, descended in an unbroken line from the first cells, having a conversation about how those first cells came to exist, and that this is one of the strangest and most extraordinary facts in the history of the universe. He paused. Daniel understood that. He could hold the mechanism and the astonishment simultaneously. Very few people can do that. "He taught me to," Sarah said quietly, and then, surprised by her own directness, "I didn't know he was teaching me, but I think he was. For 11 years. Jeff looked at her steadily, with the expression of a man recognizing something he had suspected. "Would you send me what you've written? When you're ready. I'm not asking as a critic. I'm asking because I'm curious. Because Daniel spent 18 months trying to say what this works meant, and I don't think he ever quite got there. Not in language that could reach people. Maybe," he paused, choosing carefully, "maybe that's something you could do. Maybe that's the conversation that was 3 weeks away from happening differently." She sat with that for a moment. The cafe noise went on around them. The machine, the low conversations, the particular weekday morning frequency of a place near a university. She thought about the document on her laptop, about the molecule that was both the message and the machinery, about Daniel writing, "It has to feel like the size of the thing." "I'll send it when it's ready," she said. "I think I'll know when that is." That night, she couldn't sleep. Not the bad kind of not sleeping, not the 4 a.m. devastation of the early months, the ceiling-staring grief that had no floor. This was different. This was the alert, humming wakefulness of a mind that is working on something and doesn't want to be interrupted. She got up at 2:30 and went to the study and opened the laptop. She read back through what she had written, and then she kept going, past where she had stopped, into territory she hadn't yet entered. She wrote about RNA not as a technical molecule, but as a philosophical one, the first known system in the history of the universe to be both the carrier of information and the agent of its own expression. She wrote about what that meant, that life, from its very first moment, was not a passive thing. It did not wait for conditions to be right and then exist. It participated in its own emergence. The first living chemistry was already, in some minimal but real sense, doing something about its situation. She wrote, "This is what I find almost unbearable about the science, in the best possible sense. Life did not happen to the early Earth. life happened in the early Earth, and through it, and with it, an active, partial, effortful process of becoming that required the right conditions, but was not produced by them alone. The conditions were necessary, but not sufficient. Something had to act. She stopped. Her hands were still on the keyboard. The house was absolutely quiet around her, and outside the study window, the garden was dark, and the night was warm, and the jacaranda she could not see was already beginning to set its new season's growth in the way that jacarandas do, invisibly, persistently, without apparent effort. She understood something, in that moment, that she had been approaching from a distance for months. Understanding it did not make it easier, but it made it clear in a way that was its own kind of relief. Grief was not something that happened to you and then ended. It was not a condition that resolved once the right amount of time had elapsed. It was, and she thought of Daniel's phrase as she thought this, and felt his absence and his presence simultaneously, the way she was learning to do. It was a threshold, a genuine one, a system, under pressure, reorganizing, and the reorganization was not comfortable, and it was not fast, and it had no guaranteed outcome, but it was not passive. You could not wait it out. You had to, at some point, act. She saved the document. It was 38 pages now. She thought, I am going to finish this. Whatever it is, an essay, a memoir, something without a name yet, I am going to finish it. Not for Daniel exactly, not to honor him or commemorate him or keep some version of him alive, though perhaps it would do all of those things. But because the question is real, and the question is mine now, and because somewhere in the writing of it, I think I will find the answer to the question that has been sitting inside me since the morning in the driveway, with the rain and the coat. Not, how do I survive this? That question had already, slowly, answered itself. But who do I become? She emailed Jeff at 7 the next morning. She attached the document and wrote, I think it's ready, or ready enough. I'd be grateful for whatever you think. His reply came at 8:45. She was in the kitchen, making toast, and her phone lit up on the bench, and she read it standing there with the butter knife still in her hand. It said, I've read the first 10 pages. I need you to finish this. There's a journal, not an academic one, a long-form science journal for general readers, that I think would publish this. And there is a researcher at the ANU, a PhD student named Clara Souza, who is working on exactly the question Daniel and I started in 2009, with better tools and better funding and the 15 years of field development that we didn't have. I'd like to introduce you to her, if you're willing. I think you two have things to say to each other. Sarah read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the bench and ate her toast and looked out at the garden in the early morning light and let herself feel, carefully and without rushing it, what it felt like to be standing at an edge, not falling, not yet, but close enough to feel the air change. She thought, Daniel spent 18 months asking what it takes to cross the line between not living and living. I don't think he ever quite answered it, but I think he knew the answer was somewhere close. I think the answer was always something like this. You reach the edge, and then, even when you are afraid, even when you are not ready, even when everything in you wants to step back to the solid ground of who you were, you lean forward. You lean forward, and the chemistry takes care of the rest. The journal accepted the piece on a Tuesday morning in late February, 14 months after Daniel died. The email arrived while Sarah was at the kitchen bench eating breakfast. The same bench, the same ordinary morning light, a life that looked from the outside almost identical to any other Tuesday morning, and that was, from the inside, nothing of the sort. She read the email twice. The editor had written that the piece was one of the most compelling things they had received in several years of publication, that it managed to hold the technical and the personal in a balance that was rare, and that the science was impeccable, which was Jeff's doing as much as hers. He had read 4 drafts, correcting where needed, insisting where needed, and had been throughout the most exacting and generous collaborator she could have asked for. The editor wanted a few revisions, minor ones, and then it would be scheduled for the April issue. She put the phone down on the bench. She had imagined this moment, in the abstract, for several months, had imagined feeling triumphant, or relieved, or moved in some decisive and definitive way. What she felt instead was quieter than any of those things, something closer to recognition, as though a door had opened that she had known for some time was there, and the opening of it was significant, but not surprising, because she had been standing in front of it long enough to understand its dimensions. She thought, Daniel, and then she thought nothing else for a little while. Just let his name exist in the room with her, which was something she had slowly, over 14 months, learned to do. To think of him without the thought immediately becoming an emergency. Then she finished her toast and rang Jeff and told him and listened to him make a sound that was half laugh and entirely genuine, and felt the particular warmth of a shared thing being shared. She had met Clara Souza for the first time 6 weeks earlier, on a Thursday morning in Canberra, when the summer was still heavy, but beginning to negotiate with the coming autumn. Clara was 28 years old, small and precise in her movements, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have trained themselves to notice things most people miss. She was in the 3rd year of her PhD at the ANU, working in a lab that was, in ways that still made Sarah's throat constrict slightly, doing almost exactly what Daniel and Jeff had been doing in 2009, mapping the chemical conditions under which self-replicating molecular systems could emerge and sustain themselves in hydrothermal environments, but with 15 additional years of field development behind it and a funding body that had, so far, the patience the earlier work had lacked. They had met in a cafe near the campus, at Jeff's arrangement, and Jeff himself had been there for the first half hour and then excused himself with the transparency of a man who has decided 2 people need to talk without him and is not embarrassed about arranging this. Clara had watched him go, with a small smile that suggested she was used to his maneuvers. "He told me about your husband," Clara said, when Jeff had rounded the corner. Directness delivered with warmth. The particular combination Sarah had come to associate with people who had spent years inside difficult scientific questions and had stopped being precious about approaching difficult human ones. "I'm so sorry. His work was important. I want you to know I understand that." "How much do you know about it?" Sarah asked. "Jeff sent me the draft papers last year. I'd actually come across a citation to their 2009 conference presentation before that. In a paper by Russell and Martin, I was reading for my lit review. It's a small citation, a footnote almost, but the idea in it, the thermal gradient model for ATP synthesis precursors, is something I've been building on." She paused. "I didn't know the name behind the citation was. I didn't know it was personal for you. I'm glad Jeff told me." Sarah turned her cup slowly on the table. "What's it like," she said carefully, "to be inside this question, the origin question, every day, as your work?" Clara thought about this, with the seriousness it deserved. Mostly it feels enormous and humbling and occasionally maddening, she said. But sometimes, she paused, choosing the right way in. Sometimes it feels like the closest thing I know to a religious experience, not in a supernatural sense, in the sense of encountering something so much larger and older than yourself that your own smallness stops being frightening and becomes almost comfortable. You're working on the oldest question the universe has to offer. You're 4 billion years downstream of the event you're trying to understand. And yet the chemistry is still here, still running, in every cell of every organism. The question is alive inside the thing that's asking it. Sarah sat very still. The question is alive inside the thing that's asking it. She said, Daniel wrote something in his notes. He wrote, I want to understand what was on either side of that line. The line between not living and living. She paused. Do you think we'll ever actually know? Clara's expression shifted into something more considered. I think we'll get close, she said. I think we're getting close now. We can see the conditions. We can model the chemistry. We can build protocells in the lab that do almost everything the first cells would have done. She stopped. But the specific moment, the specific configuration that crossed the line, I don't think we'll ever put our finger on it exactly, because the line wasn't that kind of line. It wasn't a wall. It was a gradient, a slow accumulation of complexity until the system was, one day, definitively doing something a non-living system cannot do. She looked at Sarah directly, which is both deeply unsatisfying and I think the truest answer available. A slow accumulation of complexity, Sarah repeated, until one day, definitively, something. Until one day, definitively something, Clara agreed. They had talked for 2.5 hours. By the end of it, Sarah had the particular lightness of a conversation that has given you more than it took. And Clara had asked if she could read the piece when it was finished. And Sarah had said, yes. And they had exchanged numbers with the unspoken understanding that this was not a single meeting, but the beginning of something less categorizable. Not friendship yet, not quite, but the precursor chemistry, the conditions in which friendship becomes possible. On the plane back to Melbourne, Sarah had looked out at the landscape below, the brown and gold of the inland summer, the slow geometry of paddocks, the shadows of clouds moving across it all in their indifferent way. And she had thought about Clara's phrase. The question is alive inside the thing that's asking it. She had thought about Daniel asking the origin question in the lab and asking the same question privately in the notebook and never quite distinguishing between the two, because perhaps at some level he had known they were the same. She had thought about herself asking it now, in writing, in the 14 months since his death, in the car and the study and the drive back from Bendigo and the 2 a.m. sessions at the desk. She had thought, I am also the question and the asker simultaneously. I have also been the molecule that is both the message and the thing that acts on it. She had thought, this is what he was trying to tell me, not just about chemistry, about everything. Robert came to Melbourne in March, the weekend before the piece was published. It was his first visit since the funeral, and the first time in many years. Daniel had always made the trip north, had always been the one who maintained the axis of that relationship because he understood, without resentment, that his father could not. Robert arrived on the Saturday morning with a bottle of wine and a paper bag of tomatoes from the garden, still warm from the vine, and stood at the door with an expression that was trying hard to be ordinary and not quite managing it. Sarah hugged him. He was stiff for a moment. the way he always was, and then something in him let go slightly, not all the way, not with the ease of a man for whom physical warmth was natural, but enough to be real. They spent the day in a way that was not comfortable exactly, but was honest in a way their previous interactions had not been, and honesty turned out to be its own form of ease. She showed him the piece, printed out, the final version, 41 pages. He read for 2 hours at the kitchen table, while she gardened, badly but with genuine engagement, pulling up the weeds that had accumulated over a winter of neglect and discovering beneath them, here and there, the surviving volunteers of previous seasons. Bulbs she hadn't planted, coming up of their own accord. The garden doing what gardens do, continuing, quietly, without permission. When she came back inside, Robert was on the last pages. She washed her hands and made tea, and set his cup beside him, and waited. He finished. He closed the pages and squared them neatly on the table, a gesture that was so recognizably his son's that she had to look away for a moment. He'd have been proud of this, Robert said. His voice was careful, the way it always was, but underneath the care was something unguarded, not just of you. He'd have been proud that the work got said, that someone said it right. We said it together, Sarah said. He said most of it years ago. I just found the language for it. Robert looked at her with the directness that had always been his most Daniel-like quality, that unself-conscious capacity for eye contact that some people mistake for severity, and that was, in both of them, simply the outward form of genuine attention. You'll keep going, he said. It was not quite a question. With the writing. With all of it. Yes, she said, simply and without qualification, which was its own kind of threshold. Yes, I will, he nodded. He picked up his tea. Outside, the first of the autumn light was beginning to make its characteristic adjustment. A degree or two of angle, a shift in quality that you noticed not because it was dramatic, but because the world looked suddenly the way it had looked the autumn before and the autumn before that. That specific quality of late-season gold that is a little melancholy and a little glorious and entirely itself. She thought Daniel would have had something to say about that light. He would have said something precise and slightly surprising, and would not have looked at her while he said it, and she would have laughed, and he would have done that thing with the corners of his eyes. The thought arrived without its previous sharpness, not blunt, still with edges, still capable of catching her when she moved carelessly, but no longer the ambush it had been, more like a tide now, predictable in its patterns, still powerful, but something you could learn to stand in rather than be knocked over by. The piece was published on a Wednesday in April. Jeff sent her a message at 6 in the morning that said only, "It's up." She opened her laptop, and there it was, her name, and beneath it the title she had chosen after months of other titles. Organized Inevitability, A Life in Chemistry, and What It Taught Me About Becoming. She read it the way you read your own published work for the first time, with a particular suspended disbelief, the sense of encountering something you made that has now become a thing in the world, with an existence independent of your making of it. It was strange to see it there, final and public, after so many months of it being private and uncertain and subject to revision. It was strange, and it was right, both at once. She read the opening paragraph, which she had written last, after everything else, when she finally understood what the piece was actually about. There is a question at the heart of the origin of life research that is also, if you listen to it carefully enough, a question about every living thing that has ever existed. Not how did life begin, though that question is extraordinary enough. But what does it mean that life, once it began, could not stop becoming? That the chemistry, once it crossed that first improbable threshold, developed an orientation toward complexity, toward responsiveness, toward the generation of new forms from old conditions, not because it was directed toward those things by any external intention, but because that is what the chemistry does when the conditions allow it. That is what it has always done. That is, in the most precise and literal sense, what it is for. She closed the laptop. She went out into the garden. The morning was cool and clear, in the particular way of early autumn in Melbourne. The light doing what it did, slanting in at that new angle, laying long shadows across the grass, illuminating things from the side, rather than above, so that everything had a slight additional dimension, a depth it had lacked an hour ago. The jacaranda was bare now, its flowers long finished, its branches holding their gray winter readiness, with a patience that needed no acknowledgement. She stood in the middle of the lawn in her bare feet, and she let the morning exist around her, completely, without trying to manage it or interpret it, or extract meaning from it beyond what it simply, straightforwardly was. A morning in April, 14 months, and some weeks after the worst thing that had ever happened to her, in a garden that was continuing to grow without her permission, in a life that was, she recognized this now, with the same quality of recognition as the door that had opened on the morning of the acceptance, continuing to. Not the same life. She did not wish for the same life. The same life had Daniel in it, and Daniel was gone, and no amount of orientation toward complexity and meaning would change that, and she did not want it changed, or softened, or made into a lesson. He was a whole person who had loved her, and whom she had loved, and who had been 3 weeks away from saying the truest things he knew, and had not gotten there. And that was a loss with no silver lining sufficient to cover it. But she was still here. The chemistry was still running. And the question she had been asking for 14 months, who do I become, was not answered in any final or tidy sense, because that was not how thresholds worked, as she now understood better than most. You did not arrive on the other side of them, complete and transformed and certain. You arrived still forming, still mid-process, still, in every meaningful sense, becoming. She was 43 years old. She had a piece published in a journal that people she respected would read. She had a PhD student in Canberra who had sent her a message the previous evening saying, "I stayed up until midnight reading it. I think your husband would have been astonished and delighted." She had a father-in-law in Bendigo who was, slowly and with enormous effort and at his own pace, learning to say the things he had kept at a distance for 69 years. She had a sister who called every second day and did not fill the silences unnecessarily. She had a garden with volunteers she hadn't planted, and a notebook on her bedside table, and a document on her laptop simply labeled Becoming that was 41 pages long and was now, permanently, a thing in the world. She had no idea what came next. She thought this was probably correct. The light moved. The shadows shifted their slow geometry across the lawn. Somewhere in the jacaranda, a small bird she couldn't see was making its case for the morning, insistently and without apparent concern for whether anyone was listening. She stood in it, all of it, for a long time. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the desk and opened a new document, and at the top of the empty page, she typed a single line. Not a title yet, just the first thing she knew. And then she stopped and looked at it and felt the particular sensation she had come to recognize as the truest available signal that something real was beginning. She began.